All right, so wrapping up anxiety disorders, here, understanding anxiety disorders, what are the explanations of them from each of our different perspectives? Well, the psychodynamic or Freudian perspective would talk about repressed impulses. Okay, all about this unconscious bubbling over and causing this anxiety. Classical conditioning or the behavioral perspective would talk about this overgeneralizing a conditioned response. Okay, and then the operant conditioning piece, rewarding or avoidance. Observational learning, worrying like mom. Cognitive appraisals. Okay, the cognitive perspective would talk about like uncertainty is danger. So we talk about your thinking patterns. And then the evolutionary perspective, surviving by avoiding danger. Okay, so every kind of perspective in psychology might understand and kind of explain anxiety disorders a little bit differently. So, from the psychodynamic perspective, again, going back to this idea of the repressed childhood impulses, socially inappropriate desires, emotional conflicts, they say they would bury them into our unconscious, but they're still going to bubble up and they're still going to influence our life, coming out in the form of anxiety. Um, Now, what about behaviorism? Classical conditioning and anxiety. So remember when we talked about little Albert and we talked about the fear and how he's associated with the scary noise? Well, sometimes the conditioned response becomes overgeneralized. Remember we talked about this idea of generalization, where you can overgeneralize it. And so one of those things has to do with the same idea with classical conditioning and anxiety, that perhaps we have some kind of conditioned response, but now we're overgeneralizing it to something else, okay? Or we're overgeneralizing it or we associate it with things that are similar. And this is where we start to get a phobia or a generalized anxiety disorder. Now, how would operant conditioning play a role? Well, we may feel anxious in a situation and that makes a decision to leave, and this makes us feel better and our anxious avoidance was just reinforced, okay? So if we know we have locked a door but feel anxious and compelled to rechecking will help us temporarily feel better. Thus, an increase in anxious thoughts and behaviors. Oh, and then the rechecking behavior. So the classical conditioning piece kind of talks about this idea of the pairing, right? The total, the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned response, and all that kind of stuff, and how that turns into anxiety. Operant conditioning goes along this idea of reinforcement. Well, if we feel anxious about something and a certain behavior alleviates that anxiousness, well, that's a reinforcer for us, and so we're going to continue to do those behaviors because it takes away that reinforcement. Okay, or it takes away that anxiety, which is a good thing, which is what we want, so we continue those behaviors. Now, what about observational learning and anxiety? Experiments with humans and monkeys show that anxiety can be acquired through observational learning. If you see someone else avoiding or fearing an object or creature, you might pick up that fear and adopt it, even if the original scared person is not around. So we do have a tendency to learn anxious behaviors from watching others. So, a lot of phobias are started off with, by watching your parents have phobias, your friends, those types of things as well. So we do know that there is an observational piece with anxiety. Um, Now, what about cognition? Obviously, cognition plays a role. It includes worried thoughts as well as interpretations, appraisals, beliefs, predictions, ruminations. Okay, now cognition includes mental habits such as hypervigilance, persistently watching out for danger, and this accompanies anxiety and PTSD. So, in anxiety disorders, such cognitions appear repeatedly and make the anxiety worse. Okay, so it's the thinking patterns that keep happening over and over. You just keep thinking about it, you keep thinking about it, they're reintrusive, and then they get reinforced and they couple with the other stuff that we've already talked about. Okay, so cognition definitely plays a role in how anxiety disorders present themselves and how they cycle downward. So what are some examples of cognitions that can worsen anxiety? Cognitive errors, such as believing that we can predict that bad things will happen. Irrational beliefs, such as bad things don't happen to good people, so if I was hurt, I must be bad. Okay, mistaken appraisals, such as seeing aches as diseases, noises as dangers, and strangers as threats. And misinterpretations of facial expressions and actions of others, such as thinking they're talking about me, so the paranoia. Okay, so all of these different cognitive kind of thinking problems, issues, can definitely play a role in how anxiety can worsen. Now, what about biology and anxiety? Now, there are human phobic objects that are natural, that are easily acquired. Snakes, heights, closed spaces, darkness. Now, similar but non-phobic things, fish, low places, open spaces, bright lights. Okay, dangerous yet non-phobic subjects. We're likely to be cautious about, but we're not phobic about guns, electric cars, and wiring, or electric wiring in cars. Okay, so again, there is an evolutionary kind of perspective about why we are phobic of certain things and why there's an increased phobia of certain things and not others. Um, Right, and so yeah, and then why not guns, electric cars, or electric wiring of cars? Well, because we just haven't been around long enough for this kind of these fears to spread. Now, what about genes? Twin studies show that identical twins, even raised separately, develop similar phobias. Okay, that some people seem to have an inborn high-strung temperaments, while others are more easygoing. Again, going back to this idea of temperament may be encoded in our genes, and your temperament definitely plays a role in your susceptibility to certain mental disorders. Genes and neurotransmitters. Obviously, remember, genes regulate levels of neurotransmitters. People with anxiety have problems with a gene associated with levels of serotonin. Okay, the neurotransmitter involved in regulating sleep and mood. So, people with anxiety also have a gene that triggers high levels of glutamate, an excitatory neurotransmitter involved in the brain's alarm centers. Okay, so remember, serotonin and glutamate are related to anxiety disorders. In terms of the brain, traumatic experiences can burn fear circuits into the amygdala. These circuits are later triggered and activated. Anxiety disorders include overarousal of brain areas involved in neural impulse and behavioral habits. Okay, the OCD brain shows extra activity in the ACC, anterior cingulate gyrus, which monitors our actions and checks for errors. Okay, so we definitely know that when you have an anxiety disorder, we are able to see it in your brain. All right, so this wraps up anxiety disorders. Next we're going to start